Welcome back to JavaSpace. So in this video we are going to talk about advice types. So for now, I'm sure that you have heard me mentioning advice multiple times, and we explained that an advice is nothing but an action that is applied at a particular join point. And then a point card is an expression that defines a join point. So an advice is just an action that you take at a particular join point. So this advice has some types, which we are going to see in this video. The first advice is a before advice. So a before advice is an action that you take before execution of that particular code at a particular join point. So if you say that you want to perform input validation before transferring money from one account to another, that's a before advice, because the action is taken before execution of a method. So what happens? Remember, we talked about proxy, that a proxy gets created which then advises a target object. So when the call comes, it comes through a proxy, which in the previous video I mentioned that a proxy then becomes a public facing interface that you communicate to. So a call will go to the proxy. Then the proxy, since this is before, which means we want, before we get to the target, to do something, the proxy would then delegate that method call to an advice. Then from there, the advice will return control to the proxy. The proxy will go to the target method. The target method will return control to the proxy, and the proxy will return to the calling to the caller. But now, with a before advice, if the target object throws an exception, sorry, not the target, if the advice, the before advice, throws an exception, the call will not be forwarded to the target object. It will just stop because the before advice has thrown an exception. Then we have after returning advice. The after returning advice, the call will come to a proxy. Then the proxy would go to a target. When the target returns successfully, that means the method execution on the target object does not throw any exception. Then the target would then come back to call the after returning advice. Then after returning advice will return control to the proxy, which will then return control to the caller. But if the target threw an exception, the proxy will not call the after returning advice, because for the after returning advice to be called, the target method must have executed successfully. So if it executes successfully, then the proxy will be able to call the after returning advice. If it throws an exception or an error, then it won't be able to go to the after returning advice. Then we have after throwing advice. So the after throwing advice, as you can see, the caller goes to the proxy goes to the target, and the target throws an exception. Then the proxy knows that the exception was thrown, then he calls the after throwing advice. Then the after throwing advice does what it needs to do. Then you see that the call now moves from the advice back to the proxy. Then the exception propagates back to the caller. So this is useful in most cases when you want to do some logging. Say, for instance, a transaction didn't maybe succeed because of data integrity violations, or a transaction was rolled back for some other reason, and then it threw an exception. And so you want to do things like send an email to notify the developer of that particular incident, or do some other thing, perform some logging, or do some auditing that you want to do. So after throwing advice is often used together with throwing attribute so that we can invoke the advice only if the matching exception was thrown. So when you use the throwing attribute, you would obviously be able to specify the exception that you are targeting. That if this exception gets thrown, I want to do something. Then you have an after advice. So remember, after returning, when an exception was thrown, the proxy doesn't go to the advice. It just doesn't call the advice. So with the after advice, we see the caller calls the proxy, and then we see that the proxy delegates to the target method, and then the target method, if it succeeds, the proxy will call the after advice. If the target method throws an exception, the proxy will still call the after advice. So regardless of the outcome of the target method, the call would still go to the advice, then back to the caller in that order. So the after advice does not really care whether it was a successful execution, or it was a failure execution. Then we have the around advice. So the around advice, as you can see here, we have the caller calling the proxy. Then we see the proxy going directly to the around advice. Then we see now the around advice now has the control. He can decide whether he wants to call the target or he wants to terminate. So in this case, you see that the call went to the around advice. The around advice delegated to the target object, which means now the developer is in control. He can delegate the call back to the target object. Then when the target object has completed, it returns to the advice, not to the proxy. Then the advice will then call the proxy when it's done. Then the proxy will call the caller. So we see with the around advice, it's not the proxy that is in control. It's the developer who has developed the around advice that is in control of the method execution, or how method should execute.